Hello everyone, this is Mr. Jackson, and we're going to be moving forward in our Concept 1 notes. We're going into Part B, where we're still on our biology review, but we're going to be talking a little bit more about those levels of organization, as well as talking about the composition of our living tissues, which is of primary interest in anatomy and physiology. In Part 1A, we left off with this slide where we introduced this idea of levels of organization. Now remember, the main thing here is that each of these levels, as we go up, build and combine the previous level. So atoms combine to form molecules, molecules combine to form cell organelles, so on and so forth. And the different arrangements or quantities of those atoms are going to create different structures and therefore functions of molecules. Different amounts or arrangements of cell organelles are going to create different types of cells. We have over 200 types in our bodies, and that's all off of the form and function from the combination and different arrangements of those levels that come beneath. And so it's a really important idea to get through. Now, we remember all living things are organized. That's one of the fundamental characteristics of all living things. And we want to remember that we are going to, in anatomy and physiology, primarily be working from the level of a human organism down to the cells that combine to form the tissues that make up that organism. And so we just want to remember that an organism, we're ultimately made up of organ systems, an example being like your digestive system. And each of those organ systems is made up of individual organs. So one organ that we're going to talk about at length in your digestive system would be your stomach. And then each of those organs are going to be made up of tissues that are specialized so that that organ can do its job. So one example would be like muscle tissue. And then finally, each of those tissues are made up of different arrangements and types of cells. So like smooth muscle cells would be an example. And it's important to understand that these cells come together to form tissues, tissues for organs, organs for organ systems, and the different arrangements again and quantities of those are ultimately what make different organs what they are. And all of those combined efforts are what make a healthy, thriving human being. And so this hierarchy of organization ultimately comes from two places. It can happen as a result of cell division or cell differentiation. And we want to make sure that we define what those are. So the process of cell division, you'll be happy to know, we're not going to have to go into great detail and have any sort of recitation of the phases of this process, but it's important to understand a couple key things when it comes to cell division. And that's that all cells come from pre-existing cells. Okay, we don't just like spontaneously have new cells come in to the mix. We have them coming from pre-existing cells via the cell cycle, and this process ultimately is going to start after fertilization of a egg by a sperm. And from that point on, the process of cell division is ultimately going to do its work to continually create new cells of varying types that ultimately will do all of the major jobs in our bodies. And this cell cycle consists of three main phases. Interphase, which is where we basically copy DNA and then we prepare for division. The actual process of division, which is mitosis. And then cytokinesis, where we just basically split the last of that fluid inside of our cells, that cytoplasm, into what will then be two identical daughter cells. And it's important to understand that whatever the genetic code of these cells is at the time of division, that is the cell that is then going to be created. And so any damage or mutation to the DNA within your cells is what is going to be passed along and be making identical copies of as we move forward. And so this is a really important idea for health and wellness that we'll get to in later units. And then you have this other side of that coin, which is differentiation. We start from one single fertilized egg, and then we have this differentiation process by which we create the over 200 different types of cells in our body. And so this is basically the process where stem cells, or those cells without jobs, are basically going to undergo a process of specialization where they're taught what their functions are going to be as they basically develop their unique structures. And this is going to depend on what we call gene expression. You can think of this as what are the specific genes or part of your DNA code that are turned on and active. And ultimately that is going to control what proteins are made and what structures are built, and that will give your cells different functions. So the organelles that ultimately make up this cell structure are what actually influence what they're going to end up specializing in. They can only do what their form allows them. And this goes back to that ultra important statement that you're going to hear me say too much, which is form dictates function. The structure of something ultimately defines and dictates what it's able to do. And then we're going to finish up here by going into what is actually making up our living tissues, right? Remember, those cells combine in different quantities and arrangements to form different types of tissues, which are going to work together for a common function. And about 70% of our living tissue is going to be made of water, okay? So majority of what you are anatomically is water. Around 26% is going to be composed of the other macromolecules. These are your proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and also your nucleic acids. We're going to talk about that in part 1C as we move forward, but we want to understand that the second most abundant thing, aside from water, are these macromolecules. These are our building blocks, and they play key biological roles in your body. And then that last little sliver in orange that you see down there on the right, that's going to consist of the remaining composition. That's going to be our charged particles, our ions. Again, we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in the next part of this lesson, but for now, we want to understand that these cells organize into tissues. What are those tissues made of? Well, water, macros, and ions and other small particles. And that is plenty to go off of for now. And so we will see you at part 1C in the next one.